The smell came first. It wasn't just an unpleasant odor. It was a physical presence, dense, that infiltrated through your pores, that stuck to your clothes, that stayed in your hair for days. Raw sewage, rotten meat, coal smoke mixed with something the human body produced when it was dying slowly. The streets were covered by a dark paste made of human excrement, remains of dead animals and industrial mud. Children walked barefoot over this. Women carried babies wrapped in rags that had been white, maybe months ago, maybe never. Inside the tenements, darkness was absolute even at noon. 20, 30 people shared a single room. They slept in shifts. There were no beds. Damp straw was the mattress. The walls sweated constant humidity. Tuberculosis was so common it stopped being a disease and became a characteristic. That cough, that blood on the lips. That progressive weight loss until the person simply disappeared, replaced by another who arrived from the countryside believing London meant opportunity. The children were too small for their age. Chronic malnutrition, stunted bones that would never grow properly. At 7 years old, they were already in the factories. Small hands reached places adults couldn't. They entered machines still in motion to clear jams. Accidents were so frequent, supervisors didn't even stop production. The child was removed, blood was washed away, another child took the position. 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The wage bought enough bread to not die of immediate starvation, but not enough to live. The rivers were no longer rivers. The Thames had become an open sewer where London dumped everything. Human feces from millions, blood from slaughterhouses, chemicals from factories that dyed the watercolors nature never invented. People still drew water from there to drink because there was no choice. The wells were contaminated by what leaked from overcrowded cemeteries. Cholera was endemic. Typhoid fever killed entire families in a week. But the factories kept running. The question no one asked out loud, but that was in every tired eye. How much is a human life worth when there are millions of them? Victorian London wasn't destroyed by a meteor or foreign invasion. It was destroyed by itself. By systematized greed, by institutionalized indifference, by the belief that material progress justified any human sacrifice as long as that sacrifice was made by others, by the poor, by the invisible, by the millions who built the greatest empire in history on their own broken bones. This is the story of the greatest suffering machine ever built by Western civilization. It's the story of how a city can shine brightly for some while devouring millions in darkness. When you think of Victorian London, you probably imagine elegant ladies in well-kept parks, gentlemen in top hats discussing philosophy, Queen Victoria in her palace. That London existed, but it was a tiny fraction of reality. The real Victorian London was a city that grew from 2 to 7 million people between 1837 and 1870. This explosive growth happened because people were being expelled from the countryside by agricultural mechanization, by enclosure laws that transformed common lands into private property. They came to London because they had no choice, and they discovered they had traded one form of misery for a worse one. This was the golden age of Great Britain. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's population. The Industrial Revolution had transformed England into the workshop of the world. Wealth flowed to London from every corner of the empire. But this wealth didn't distribute. It concentrated in the hands of a class so small you could gather all the truly wealthy in a single ballroom. The infant mortality rate in working-class neighborhoods like Whitechapel exceeded 50%. Half the children born didn't reach 5 years old, from malnutrition, from lack of basic sanitation, from early labor. Average life expectancy was 40 years, but if you were born rich, you could live to 70. If you were born poor, your expectancy was 25 years. The difference between rich and poor was literally a matter of life or death. But no one called this a tragedy. They called it progress, modernization. Economists argued low wages were essential for British competitiveness. Victorian moralists preached that poverty resulted from laziness. Politicians passed laws that made it even harder for the poor to survive. Victorian London was two cities occupying the same geographic space, but existing in completely different realities. One London of gaslight illuminating theatres. Another, London where the only light came from tallow candles made with rancid animal fat. One London of 7-course dinners. Another, London where children rummaged through garbage looking for potato peels to eat. And these two Londons weren't geographically separated. Walking 15 minutes, you crossed the invisible border and entered a hell most wealthy Londoners pretended didn't exist. But where did this system come from? The answer lies in the English countryside, decades before the Victorian era. Villages that had existed since the Middle Ages, families who had worked the same lands for generations. They had a piece of common land where they could plant vegetables, right to graze some sheep, access to forests to collect firewood. It was a subsistence economy, but it was stable. Then came the enclosure laws. Laws that allowed large landowners to fence lands that had previously been common. They transformed open fields into private property. They expelled families who had lived there for centuries. The justification was efficiency, and it was true that larger farms were more productive. But the food didn't go to those who produced it. The profits didn't stay in communities, and people who previously had autonomy now had nothing. Only their labor power to sell. Most simply had no place. The only option was to migrate to cities, to London above all. They arrived with hope and discovered a reality no amount of hard work could overcome. The first factories weren't built thinking of human beings. They were built thinking of production efficiency. Tall, narrow buildings. Small windows because glass was expensive. Minimal ventilation. Machines crammed together. Workers were treated as extensions of machines. The machine determined the rhythm. The worker adapted or was replaced. And there was always someone desperate enough to accept any condition. By expelling millions from the countryside simultaneously, a permanent labor surplus was created. Conditions in factories were beyond what the modern mind can process. 14 consecutive hours in buildings without adequate windows. Deafening noise. No meal breaks, no adequate bathrooms. Temperature varied extremely. In summer, it exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, there was no heating. Accidents were so common, each factory had an area for dealing with amputated limbs, fingers caught in gears, hands crushed by presses. The standard response was quick cauterization with hot iron and return to work. There was no compensation. If you couldn't work anymore, you were fired. For children, it was worse. Their small bodies were an advantage. They crawled under looms still in motion. In coal mines, they worked in tunnels so narrow adults didn't fit. Some started at 5 years old. Physical deformation was inevitable. Stunted growth, permanently curved spine, damaged lungs. And all of this was perfectly legal. More than legal, it was celebrated as a triumph of British entrepreneurship. The brutality didn't end when the shift ended. Workers went to tenements built by the same factory owners who charged rent that consumed half the miserable wage. Buildings 5, 6 stories tall, built as cheaply as possible. Without plumbing, sewage ran down walls. Entire families lived in 10 by 10 foot rooms. Population density was incomprehensible, more than 100 people per building. This was the system Victorian London perfected. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate design. Because it worked wonderfully well for a tiny minority. If you were among the millions living in this reality, each day was a war against death. Not dramatic death, but death by erosion. Your body being consumed slowly by work, by hunger, by disease. The day began before dawn. Factory whistles cut through the air at 4 in the morning. That sound was law. Ignoring it meant losing your job, and losing your job meant hunger. You went out into streets still dark. There was no breakfast. Maybe a piece of stale bread, More likely nothing. The Thames docks were where many men worked, loading and unloading ships, sugar from the Caribbean, tea from India, cotton from Egypt, the entire empire flowing through London. Work was chaotic and brutal. There were no guaranteed jobs. Every day, hundreds of men gathered at gates hoping to be chosen. Those not chosen earned nothing. For women, options were even more limited and wages even lower. Domestic work was most common. Being a maid meant working 17, 18 hours a day, waking before employers to light fires. Wages were a fraction of what men earned. Many women worked in sewing factories, 18 hours sewing by hand under candlelight. Vision deteriorated rapidly. By 30, many were practically blind. And then there was prostitution. Not because women chose it, but because it was that or starve. It's estimated there were 80,000 prostitutes in Victorian London. Most started as teenagers, selling their bodies for pennies. For working children, life was brutal acceleration. 7-year-old children working as chimney sweeps, climbing vertical tunnels covered in toxic soot, getting stuck, suffocating. It was legal. It was normal. Food was a constant struggle against hunger. Bread was the staple. Bread of horrible quality, often adulterated with chalk or sawdust. Meat was rare. Milk was often watered down and contaminated. Drinking water was a constant problem. Wells were contaminated. The Thames was an open sewer. Cholera swept through London in waves. There was no understanding of transmission through contaminated water. Death rate during outbreaks exceeded 1,000 people per day. Tuberculosis was a slow pandemic. There was no treatment. You simply wasted away over months or years. Childhood diseases killed half the children before 5 years old. Victorian parents expected to lose children. Winter was when death accelerated. Cold without adequate heating. Coal was too expensive. Hypothermia killed regularly. There was no safety net, no unemployment insurance, no pensions, no public health care. Workhouses were the last resort. Families were immediately separated. They worked breaking stones, received minimal food. Many preferred to die in the streets. This was the daily life of millions, not exceptions, the norm. Meanwhile, a few miles away, another world existed. Mayfair, Belgravia, Kensington. Houses were mansions, dozens of rooms, private gardens. A single family occupied space sufficient to house 100 working families. Interiors were museums of imperial wealth, Persian carpets, Chinese porcelain, French furniture. Meals were rituals of excess. Breakfast with eggs, bacon, sausages, dinner with 7, 8 courses, all served by staff of servants. Wealthy Victorians didn't work in the sense workers understood. Men managed investments, went to clubs, hunted. Their lives were dedicated to sophisticated leisure. And all of this was built on brutal exploitation of the working class. Every luxury object was produced by someone working in miserable conditions. Every elaborate meal used ingredients transported by dock workers. Every elegant piece of clothing was sewn by women ruining their vision, but there was no acknowledgement of this. There were elaborate justifications, theories about superior and inferior races, about the poor being morally and intellectually deficient. Darwin had published On the Origin of Species, and the Victorian elite immediately distorted his ideas into social Darwinism. The notion that the rich were naturally superior. There was philanthropy. The wealthy donated to charitable causes, but always with conditions, always reinforcing hierarchy. The poor had to prove they were deserving. The church supported this system. It preached acceptance. It said earthly suffering would be rewarded in heaven. Religion was literally the opiate of the people. Laws were written by the rich to protect the rich. Property was sacred. Stealing bread out of hunger was a capital crime. Working children to death was legitimate business practice. And all of this happened in the same city. Physical proximity made social separation even more deliberate. It wasn't that the rich didn't know, it was that they didn't care. The most visible problem was the Thames. The river had become London's intestine. Every drop of sewage from millions went straight there, without treatment. For centuries, this had been manageable. But with exploding population, volume completely exceeded the river's capacity. The smell was legendary. During hot summers, the stench was so intense, people vomited. Parliament had to be evacuated several times. They called it the Great Stink of 1858. For weeks, all of London was enveloped in fetid miasma. Businesses closed. The wealthy fled to the countryside. The poor, with no option, suffered. But smell was just a symptom. The real problem was disease. Thames water was still a source of drinking water. Companies pumped directly from the river, did minimal filtration. The same houses dumped sewage back. Cholera was the deadliest consequence. The 1849 epidemic killed more than 14,000 people. Dr. John Snow noticed cholera came from contaminated water, but miasma theory was so entrenched evidence was ignored. Cemeteries were so overcrowded they became sanitary hazards. Bodies were buried stacked. Decomposition liquid infiltrated soil, reached water tables, contaminated wells. Air in London was almost as lethal as water. Smoke from hundreds of thousands of fireplaces burning coal. Factory emissions. It created thick fog that reduced visibility to yards. Respiratory diseases were a chronic pandemic. Bronchitis, pneumonia, workers' lungs became literally black. For children, polluted air caused rickets, vitamin D deficiency, soft bones that deformed. The medical system didn't help. Doctors were for the rich. Hospitals were feared places. Mortality rate in hospitals was higher than at home. Surgeries were done without sterilization. Anesthesia was new and poorly understood. Edwin Chadwick had published a report detailing how poor conditions cause disease. He proposed solutions: clean water, adequate sewage. Response was minimal, because solutions cost money. The only reason something was eventually done was when it became clear disease didn't respect class boundaries. In 1859, after the Great Stink, Parliament approved funding for a sewage system. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed a network of tunnels. It took years, and it worked. Cholera was eliminated, but note, it took the rich being bothered before they did something. Thousands of poor dying wasn't enough. While diseases killed through biology, the economic system killed through systematic exhaustion. And when people began to resist, they encountered structural violence ready to crush them. The first labor movements were almost suicidal in their courage. Organizing was illegal. Being caught meant prison, deportation, sometimes execution. But people organized because the alternative was to die slowly. The first strikes were desperate. Workers asking for minimum wage, reduction of hours. These weren't radical demands. They were requests for conditions marginally less lethal. Employer responses were relentless. Strikers were fired. Blacklists ensured they'd never find work. Families were evicted. And if that didn't work, there was violence. Thugs beat leaders. Police raided meetings. There were massacres. Cavalry charging unarmed crowds. Press portrayed organizers as foreign agitators, anarchists, threats to order. But despite repression, movements grew. The Combination Acts were repealed in 1824. Unions became legal, though restricted. Skilled workers managed to organize first. They formed unions focused on peaceful negotiation. They achieved some small victories. But for masses of unskilled workers, progress was glacial. The Chartist movement tried change through politics. It petitioned for universal male suffrage, collected millions of signatures. Parliament rejected. When Chartists radicalized, leadership was arrested. The message was clear: the system wouldn't change voluntarily. Karl Marx lived in London during this period. He wrote Das Kapital, analyzing exactly how capitalism worked. His ideas were seen as dangerous because they identified the system itself as the problem. Many workers didn't know Marx, but they understood they were being crushed by a system that benefited the few. There was anger, deep, justified, but channeling anger was nearly impossible under repression. So workers sought relief where they could. Alcohol was the most common escape. Gin houses offered temporary oblivion. Addiction was epidemic. Some sought religion. Methodism offered community, but also preached resignation. Some turned to crime. Gangs controlled territories. The legal system responded with cruelty. Full prisons, deportations, public executions, and there were those who simply gave up. Suicide was common. Jumping into the Thames was a frequent method. The catastrophe wasn't just material, it was systematic destruction of human dignity, of hope. The system was killing not just bodies but souls, and when desperation reaches certain levels, it generates fanaticism, need to find someone to blame. Anti-Semitism was a structural part. Jews were seen as other. When the economy entered recession, discourse turned against Jews, accusations they controlled banks. There were pogroms, violence was real. Irish immigrants were another target. Fleeing the Great Famine, they arrived desperate. They were blamed for lowering wages. Signs, "No Irish need apply." Women who sold sex were treated as a moral problem. Victorian society had an obsession with female purity. Reality was that many were forced by economic circumstances. But society blamed them. The Contagious Diseases Acts allowed police to arrest any woman suspected of prostitution and force invasive medical examination. Men weren't examined. There were those who channeled desperation into religious extremism. End times preachers. The Salvation Army offered soup and sermons. The temperance movement argued alcohol was the root of problems. It blamed victims. The Jack the Ripper murders in 1888 exemplify this environment. 5 prostitutes brutally murdered, never solved. Police were incompetent, didn't care because victims were prostitutes. Media sensationalized, but didn't question why women were forced to sell sex on the most dangerous streets. This was London at its darkest period. Not just unequal, but actively cruel. To fully understand the scale, we need to look beyond London, to the English countryside, to the Empire. The countryside wasn't a pastoral paradise. It was a place of structural poverty. Enclosure laws had transformed peasants into the landless. Rural wages were even worse than urban ones. Bad harvests meant hunger. But it was from the empire that the true scale of exploitation became clear. India was the jewel in the crown, and it was systematically plundered. The empire destroyed Indian textile industry. It forced India to produce raw cotton sent to English factories. Famines in India killed millions, not because there was no food, but because the system forced grain to be sent to England even during local shortages. Free market, they argued. Millions died. Africa was seen as a source of resources. Mines were worked in conditions that made London factories look humane. Forced labor, deaths from accidents weren't recorded. All this wealth flowed to London, to banks, to investors' pockets who never saw the blood their profits were steeped in. London was the center of a global network of exploitation, and this system was presented as civilizing. White man's burden. Racism was the ideological foundation. Pseudo-scientific theories about superior races. But in London, this was invisible. People didn't see connections. The elite knew, but didn't care. This was the true cost. Not just millions of Londoners living in misery, but hundreds of millions globally exploited. The catastrophe was global. And like all structures based on fundamental injustice, it contained the seeds of its own destruction. Eventually, even the cruelest systems begin to generate enough resistance that change becomes inevitable. Reforms began slowly, factory acts limiting child labor hours, not out of kindness, but because it became clear killing children so rapidly wasn't sustainable. Public health acts improving sanitation, not out of concern for the poor, but because diseases didn't respect boundaries. Education acts providing basic education, because the economy needed workers who could read. Each reform was a fight. Businessmen argued regulations would destroy competitiveness. But reformers persisted. The Paris Commune in 1871 scared elites. Workers taking control of a city. It was crushed, but the message was clear. Reform was a strategy to preserve the system while changing it to avoid revolution. Unions were gradually legalized. Workers could negotiate. Strikes became legitimate tools. Hours reduced. Wages increasing. The Labour Party was founded in 1900. First-time workers had their own representation. Voting rights were gradually expanded. Women began organizing, suffragettes adopting militant tactics, breaking windows, being arrested. They persisted. Medical science began understanding diseases, germ theory, pasteurization, antisepsis, vaccination. Life expectancy began rising, infant mortality falling, education expanded. Literacy rates rose. Public libraries were established, but it would be a mistake to romanticize progress. Even by 1900, most still lived in poverty. Inequality was slightly less obscene, but still monstrous. And progress in England was financed by intensified colonial exploitation. But change was happening. A system that seemed immutable was being forced to reform. The catastrophe was receding. Not because it had run its course, but because resistance accumulated strength. The 20th century brought transformations. World War I destroyed the old order. Millions died. Women entered the workforce. Old certainties crumbled. Post-war, society couldn't return to what it was. The welfare state began taking shape. The NHS was established in 1948. Universal healthcare, social housing replaced tenements. Education became compulsory and free. Child labor was eliminated. Work hours were limited. Minimum wage was established. Unions became powerful. Inequality wasn't eliminated, but the gap narrowed. The middle class expanded. The empire crumbled. India gained independence in 1947. London stopped being the center of empire. Technology transformed life. Medicine advanced. Life expectancy doubled, but every gain was fought for. And looking at modern London, it's easy to forget how recent this transformation was. People born in the Victorian era lived into the 1960s, and legacies persist. Structural inequality. Ideology that the rich deserve wealth. Many battles are still being fought. So what have we learned? Looking at Victorian London, seeing a system that accepted suffering at industrial scale as the cost of progress, what does this tell us? First, that progress isn't inevitable. London could have continued if not for organized resistance. The elite never voluntarily gives up privileges. Change comes from below. Second, that cruelty can be systematized. It didn't need individual monsters, just a system where profit was maximized and humanity was irrelevant. Third, that invisibility is a tool of oppression. As long as suffering was kept out of sight, it could continue. When forced into visibility, change became possible. Fourth, that justifications always exist. Every era finds narratives to explain injustice. Victorians had social Darwinism. We have updated versions. Fifth, that change is slow and partial. Reforms improved lives but didn't eliminate fundamental inequality. And perhaps most disturbingly, that we are capable of rationalizing almost any suffering if it doesn't affect us directly. Victorians weren't biologically different, but they participated in a system of cruelty with clear consciences. What do we do today that future generations will look at with horror? Where are our blind spots? There are workers in distant countries producing goods in conditions that echo Victorian factories. There's growing inequality. There are refugees treated as problems. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. Victorian London wasn't an aberration. It was the logical result of a system that valued profit above people. Variations of that system still operate. The great question isn't whether we're better than the Victorians. The question is whether we've learned fundamental lessons, whether we've built safeguards, whether we're vigilant. Victorian London was an experiment in how far you can push humanity. The system eventually generated resistance to forced transformation. But transformation wasn't complete, it wasn't permanent. The struggle continues, it always will. As long as there's inequality of power, there will be exploitation. And as long as there's exploitation, there will be resistance. Victorian London is a warning, and it's inspiration, warning of how bad systems can get. Inspiration that even entrenched systems can be changed. But perhaps the most important lesson is about memory, about not forgetting. It's convenient to see the past as completely different. It allows comfortable distance. But Victorian people were humans with the same moral capacity we have. Some resisted, others participated, most tried to survive. And structures that created Victorian London, unregulated capitalism, concentration of wealth, ideologies justifying inequality, didn't disappear. They were modified, but not eliminated. Each generation has to fight the same battles again. Workers' rights, environmental protection, social justice, nothing is permanently guaranteed. Modern London exists because generations fought to transform it. It didn't happen naturally. It was conquered through decades of organizing, protest, sacrifice. Memory of Victorian London should serve as a vaccine, a reminder of what happens when we allow the market to dominate completely. But memory fails. Each generation rediscovers lessons. So maybe what we need isn't just to remember as distant history, but to see continuities in the present, to see modern workers without protections, to see homeless people, to see growing inequality. Victorian London didn't end in 1901. It transformed. Elements persisted in new forms, and the struggle that began on those streets continues in different forms, but fundamentally the same struggle between those who want to concentrate power and those who want to distribute dignity. Victorians who resisted were fighting for us, for a future they wouldn't see, and we inherited the world they created. Now it's our turn, our responsibility, not just to preserve gains, but to push forward, because work is never complete. Victorian London teaches us that systems that seem immutable can change, that ordinary people, organized, can transform worlds, that the future isn't written, it's being written by our choices. So we close our look at Victorian London, city of impossible contrasts, of obscene wealth and abject poverty, of technological progress and human regression. Every stone of modern London was laid by working hands. Every institution was built through struggles. Every right was won through sacrifice. Nothing was given, everything was conquered, and nothing is guaranteed permanently. History has no ending, and the next chapter is being written now, by our choices about what kind of society we want. Do we want a society that values profit above people, or people above profit? Do we want concentration of power, or distribution of dignity? Do we want to repeat mistakes, or learn from them? Questions aren't abstract, they're immediate, urgent, and answers will determine what world we leave. Victorian London is a mirror, and in the reflection we see not just the past, but elements of our present and possibilities of our future. The choice is ours, as it always has been, as it always will be. Thank you for walking through this history, for witnessing suffering, for confronting uncomfortable truths. But don't end here. Take these lessons, use them, let them inform how you see the world, how you participate, how you work to transform it. Because history isn't just about understanding the past, it's about building the future. And the future is waiting. It isn't written, it's blank, awaiting our choices. Make them wisely, make them courageously, with awareness of all who came before, who suffered, who fought, who won impossible battles. You are heir to their struggles, an architect of what comes next. That's a heavy responsibility, but it's also an extraordinary privilege. Use it well.